Hello, dear friend, and welcome to this quiet corner of the evening where the world seems to pause and the shadows lengthen into stories. I wonder, as you settle in, where in this wide world are you listening tonight? And does the air around you carry the scent of rain, or the hushed stillness of a sleeping house? Here in London, the yellow fog is a heavy velvet curtain drawn tight against the window panes of Baker Street, obscuring the world beyond and turning the distant gas lamps into pale amber ghosts. Inside our rooms, the air is thick with the comforting perfume of old leather bindings and the sharp, pleasant tang of Holmes's navy tobacco, while the tea in my porcelain cup remains just warm enough to send a thin curl of steam dancing toward the soot-stained ceiling. The fire in the grate is a living thing, breathing in soft, rhythmic pulses that cast a flickering orange glow over the scattered papers and the violin case resting in the corner. You can hear it, can't you? The way the embers shift and settle with a sound like a whispered secret. While far below on the cobblestones, the rhythmic clip-clop of a passing hansom cab fades slowly into the damp silence of the night. It was on such an evening, when the quiet seemed almost too heavy to bear, that the mystery of the phantom footsteps first intruded upon our sanctuary. The case began not with a frantic knock or a desperate letter, but with the haunting memory of a sound that should not have been, a heavy and deliberate tread upon the floorboards of an empty attic in a house that had known only silence for a century. The carriage wheels crunched softly against the rain-softened gravel of the drive, a rhythmic, repetitive sound that seemed to harmonize with the distant, low moan of the wind through the ancient yews. Beside me, Sherlock Holmes sat in complete silence, his chin resting upon his folded hands, his eyes distant and clouded with the particular sort of introspection that always preceded a descent into the unknown. The manor itself loomed out of the greyish mist like a slumbering beast of stone and ivy, its many windows dark and unreflective, save for a single amber glow that flickered in a high corner of the eastern wing. We stepped out into the chill air, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves rising to meet us, a pungent reminder of the season's slow surrender to winter. The front door was a massive slab of dark oak, scarred by time and weather, and, as our client, Mr. Julian Blackwood, pulled it open, the hinges gave a long, low cry that echoed through the cavernous hallway beyond. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of beeswax, old parchment, and the lingering, ghostly sweetness of lavender sachets hidden away in long-forgotten drawers. We were led into a drawing room where a fire had been coaxed into a modest life, its flames casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the spines of leather-bound books and the heavy velvet curtains that muffled the world outside. Julian Blackwood was a man who seemed to have been carved from the very shadows of his home, his face pale and lined with a weariness that went deeper than mere lack of sleep. He gestured for us to sit in two high-backed wing chairs, the fabric of which felt cool and slightly damp to the touch, and as he began to speak, his voice was little more than a whisper that struggled to rise above the crackle of the hearth. He spoke of his grandfather, General Silas Blackwood, a man of iron will and a thunderous presence who had ruled this house with a firm hand until his passing some 20 years ago. The general had returned from the Afghan wars with a shattered knee that never truly healed, leaving him with a distinctive, heavy-footed gait, a rhythmic drag, followed by a sharp, metallic click of his brass-tipped cane. It was this very sound, Julian explained with a tremor in his hand as he poured tea from a silver pot, that had begun to manifest in the dead of night, pacing the length of the upstairs gallery with a precision that defied the silence of the grave. Holmes took his cup, the steam rising in a delicate, swirling ribbon that caught the golden light of the fire, and he leaned back, his eyes fixed on a large oil portrait that hung above the mantelpiece. The portrait depicted the general in his full military regalia, his gaze stern and unforgiving, his right hand resting heavily upon the very cane that now haunted the dreams of his grandson. The silence in the room grew heavy, punctuated only by the slow, deliberate ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, a sound that seemed to count down the minutes until the sun vanished entirely behind the jagged horizon. We sat in that thickening twilight for a long time, the shadows stretching across the floor like reaching fingers, while Holmes remained motionless, absorbing the atmosphere of the house as if it were a physical substance. He eventually rose and began to pace the room himself, though his steps were light and cat-like, his long fingers trailing over the surfaces of the furniture, feeling for vibrations or the subtle shifts in the air that only he could perceive. As night fully descended upon Blackwood Manor, the house seemed to contract and settle, the timbers groaning under the weight of the dark. We moved to the library, a vast, circular room lined from floor to ceiling with the accumulated knowledge of centuries, where the air was even colder and smelled of dust and old leather. A single lamp burned on a central table, casting a small circle of light that barely reached the shadowed alcoves where the ancestors of the Blackwood line watched from their frames. Julian led us to the gallery above, a narrow wooden walkway that circled the library and led to the bedchambers. And it was here, he whispered, that the phantom footsteps always began their nightly circuit. Holmes knelt on the polished wood, his magnifying glass held close to the floorboards, examining the grain and the joints with a focus that bordered on the spiritual. He noted the slight warping of the timber near the heavy oak balustrade and the way the shadows pooled in the corners, creating illusions of depth where there should have been none. The hours crawled by with a deliberate slowness, each minute marked by the distant, rhythmic tolling of a church bell from the village below, the sound muffled by the thick blankets of mist that now pressed against the window panes. We retreated to the drawing room once more to wait, the fire having burnt down to a bed of glowing embers that pulsed with a dull subterranean red. Holmes had requested that all lamps be extinguished, leaving us in a darkness so profound that the boundaries of the room seemed to dissolve, leaving us floating in a void of cold air and memory. I could hear the steady, rhythmic breathing of our host, a jagged sound that betrayed his terror, and the soft, dry rustle of Holmes shifting his weight as he adjusted his position. The smell of tobacco smoke, faint and acrid, began to drift through the air as Holmes lit a single pipe, the small coal of the bowl glowing like a solitary eye in the gloom. Then, as the grandfather clock began its heavy, mechanical preparation to strike the hour of midnight, the atmosphere in the house changed. It was not a sudden shift, but a gradual thickening of the silence, a sensation of pressure, as if the very walls were leaning inward to listen. The first stroke of the bell rang out, deep and resonant, vibrating through the floorboards and up into the soles of my boots. 1, 2, 3, the counts felt like heartbeats in the chest of the manor. And then, as the final echo of the 12th stroke died away into a shimmering stillness, the sound began. It was unmistakable, a heavy, dragging thud, followed by the sharp, crystalline strike of metal on wood. Drag, clump. Drag, clump. It started at the far end of the upper gallery, directly above our heads, moving with a slow, purposeful deliberation that spoke of an old man with a burdened heart and a ruined leg. I felt a cold prickle of dread crawl up my spine, a primal reaction to the impossible, for there was no one in the house but ourselves and the servants who had long since retired to the distant wing. The sound was not muffled or distant. It was vibrant and immediate, the wood of the ceiling creaking under the weight of an invisible trespasser. Holmes did not move, but I saw the glow of his pipe brighten as he took a long, thoughtful draw, the light illuminating the sharp bridge of his nose and the intense, calculating spark in his eyes. The footsteps reached the centre of the gallery and then stopped, the silence that followed being even more oppressive than the sound itself. It was as if the presence were looking down upon us, its unseen eyes peering through the darkness to gauge our resolve. Then, with a suddenness that made Julian gasp, the pacing resumed, turning back toward the stairs that led down into the hall. We rose as one, Holmes moving with a silent grace that I sought to emulate despite the trembling of my own limbs. We stood at the threshold of the drawing room, looking out into the darkened hallway where the grand staircase rose like the spine of a great beast into the gloom above. The footsteps were descending now, each one distinct and heavy, the metallic click of the cane ringing out against the stone steps with a clarity that was terrifying. There was no visual manifestation, no shimmering shroud or pale face peering through the banisters. Only the relentless, rhythmic progress of a phantom that knew its path by heart. As the sound reached the bottom of the stairs, it paused again, and a cold draught swept through the hall, carrying with it the faint, unmistakable scent of old snuff and wet wool, the scents, as Julian had told us, that were forever associated with his grandfather's presence. Holmes stepped forward into the hallway, his hand reaching out into the empty air as if to catch a drifting thread. He followed the sound as it moved toward the heavy doors of the library, his movements synchronized with the invisible walker. The library doors, which we had left firmly shut, did not open. Yet the footsteps continued within, the sound now muffled by the thick wood, but still perfectly audible in the expectant silence. We pushed the doors open and the air inside was noticeably colder, the small lamp we had left burning having flickered out, leaving only the pale, ghostly light of the moon to filter through the high, arched windows. The moonlight fell in long silver ribbons across the floor, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny, frantic spirits. The pacing continued around the perimeter of the circular room, moving past the shelves of histories and the alcoves of philosophy, until it reached a particular section of the wall where the general had kept his most prized military maps and trophies. There, the sound stopped. There was a long, expectant pause, and then a series of 3 sharp raps, as if a cane were being struck against the wainscoting. Holmes approached the spot, his fingers tracing the ornate carvings of the dark wood panelling, his touch light and inquisitive. He pressed firmly against a decorative rosewood inlay, and with a soft sliding click, a concealed drawer popped open, revealing a cache of yellowed letters and a small, leather-bound diary. As the drawer opened, the heavy atmosphere in the room seemed to dissipate, the oppressive weight lifting from our chests like a fog burning off under the morning sun. The silence that returned was no longer expectant but peaceful, the natural silence of an old house at rest. Julian slumped against a mahogany desk, his breath coming in ragged gasps of relief, while Holmes took the diary to the window, the silver moonlight bathing the pages as he began to turn them with a practiced hand. The script was crabbed and difficult, the hand of a man who was more comfortable with a sword than a pen. But the entries told a story of a hidden regret, a secret debt that had weighed upon the general's soul long after his body had failed him. We returned to the drawing room, where the fire had died down to a faint, orange glow, and Holmes began to speak, his voice a low, soothing murmur that seemed to knit the fractured piece of the house back together. He explained how the rhythmic sounds were not the movements of a spirit, but the result of a meticulously designed architectural curiosity. The general, in his later years, had become obsessed with the idea of a mechanical guardian, a way to ensure that his presence would be felt, even when he was no longer able to patrol his halls. He had commissioned a series of weighted bellows and clockwork triggers concealed beneath the floorboards, powered by the natural expansion and contraction of the house's ancient timbers as the temperature dropped at night. The midnight hour, with its specific thermal shift, served as the catalyst for the mechanism, releasing a series of wooden hammers and metallic strikes that mimicked his own laboured gait. The hidden drawer and the diary were the general's final instructions, a way to ensure that the secret of the mechanism would only be found by someone with the patience to listen and the intellect to follow the sound to its source. The diary revealed that the general had left a portion of his estate to the family of a soldier who had saved his life in the mountains of the Hindu Kush, a debt that had been obscured by legal tangles and the general's own pride. By leading his heir to the documents, the general had ensured that his honour would finally be satisfied, and the phantom footsteps, having fulfilled their purpose, would eventually fall silent as the clockwork grew rusted and still. As Holmes spoke, the first light of dawn began to grey the edges of the curtains. The long, terrifying night finally drawing to a close. The manor no longer felt like a place of haunting, but a place of history, its shadows retreating before the soft, persistent light of the new day. We watched as Julian Blackwood took the diary in his hands, his face transformed by a sense of purpose that had been missing for years. The weight of the past had been lifted, not by the banishment of a ghost, but by the understanding of a man's heart. We departed Blackwood Manor as the sun began to climb above the mist-covered hills, the air crisp and filled with the promise of a clear morning. The carriage ride back to the station was quiet. The only sound, the steady trot of the horses and the occasional chirp of a waking bird. Holmes sat with his eyes closed, his face pale in the morning light, the intensity of the night's work having left him in a state of tranquil exhaustion. I looked back at the house one last time, its stone walls glowing faintly in the sun, and I thought of the old general and the mechanical echoes he had left behind. The world is full of mysteries that whisper to us from the shadows, I mused, but it is the human heart that provides the most enduring hauntings of all. Back in the familiar comfort of Baker Street, the fire was lit and the tea was hot. The familiar smells of our own lives welcoming us home. The city was waking up, the rumble of traffic and the cries of street vendors, a sharp contrast to the profound silence of the countryside. Holmes took up his violin and began to play a slow, melancholic air that seemed to capture the essence of the night we had just lived through, the notes rising and falling like the mist over the manor. I sat in my chair, the memory of the drag and clump of the invisible cane still echoing faintly in my mind. A reminder that even in our modern age of reason, there are corners of the world where the past still walks, demanding to be heard. And as the music filled the room, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The quiet mystery of Blackwood Manor finally laid to rest, leaving behind only the gentle rhythmic pulse of the city and the steady, reassuring presence of my friend. The manor house of Blackwood Hall stood in the gloaming like a tired beast, its ancient stones drinking the lingering damp of the evening mist, while inside, Sherlock Holmes knelt upon the age-blackened oak of the long corridor that led toward the ancestral library. The air in this part of the house was thick with the scent of beeswax and the faint acidic tang of very old paper, a smell that seemed to have seeped out of the library over the centuries to settle into the very grain of the wood. I watched him from the doorway, the light of my handheld candle casting long, trembling shadows that danced against the heavy brocade wallpaper, while Holmes moved with the silent, predatory grace of a cat. He did not speak, for the silence of the house was a delicate thing that we felt loath to shatter. But instead, he pulled from his pocket a small, silver tuning fork and a physician's stethoscope, tools of a most unusual nature for a man investigating the restless spirits of the dead. He struck the fork against his palm and then pressed the vibrating metal to the floorboards. His head tilted as he listened to the resonance of the timber, his eyes half closed, as if he could see the vibrations travelling through the joists and beams like ripples on the surface of a dark pond. The floor beneath us was a patchwork of history, where the original Tudor heart of the home met the more rigid, precise additions of the Georgian era. And as Holmes moved his stethoscope along the seams of the wood, he seemed to be reading the house's very skeleton. He whispered to me that every house has its own particular music, a symphony of settling stones and contracting wood. Yet here, the rhythm was syncopated, broken by a secondary heartbeat that did not belong to the natural order of things. He moved toward the great staircase, where the shadows gathered in pools as deep as ink. And there he spent a long hour tapping at the risers and the ornate balustrades, tracing the path of the sound that the servants claimed was the heavy, dragging tread of the late General Blackwood. The staff, poor souls, were huddled in the kitchen below, their terror palpable even through the thick floorboards. And as the clock in the hall began its slow, mournful chime for 10, I saw the flicker of a white apron in the distance, a young maid crossing the far end of the hall with such haste and such wide staring eyes that she looked like a phantom herself. As the night deepened, The atmosphere within the manor shifted from a mere stillness to a heavy, suffocating pressure, as though the walls were leaning inward to catch the sound of our breathing. Holmes suggested we douse our lights, and so we sat in the absolute darkness of the upper gallery, the only illumination provided by the pale, filtered moonlight that struggled through the high, leaded windows to cast silver rectangles upon the dust-moated air. We sat in silence for hours, the only sound being the distant, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere in the depths of the house, and the occasional, lonely cry of an owl in the woods outside. My senses became preternaturally sharp in the void. I could smell the cold ash in the hearth, the faint aroma of the shag tobacco. Holmes had smoked earlier in the day, and the crisp, metallic scent of the freezing night air that leaked through the window frames. It was then, in the deepest part of the night, when the soul feels most vulnerable, that the sound began a slow, deliberate thud, followed by a dragging rasp, as if a heavy boot were being pulled across the floorboards with great effort. It started at the far end of the gallery, near a portrait of the general that seemed to watch us with cold, painted eyes. And as the sound approached, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise in an ancient, instinctive response to the unknown. The rhythm was perfect, almost too perfect, and as the unseen presence moved past us, I felt a faint vibration in the floor beneath my chair, a subtle shudder that felt more mechanical than ghostly. Holmes reached out in the dark and gripped my arm, his fingers like iron, signalling for me to remain still while he leaned forward, his own breath held in his chest. The footsteps continued toward the library, and then, with a soft, clicking sound like the latching of a door, they ceased entirely, leaving the silence even more profound than it had been before. Holmes stood up then, his movements a blur in the dim moonlight, and led me toward the spot where the sound had vanished, his hands roaming over the wood-panelled walls with a sensitivity that was nothing short of miraculous. He found it behind a heavy, velvet curtain that smelled of dust and forgotten winters, a small, recessed lever hidden within the intricate carving of a rosewood pilaster. With a gentle pressure, the panelling swung inward on well-oiled hinges that made no more sound than a sigh, revealing a narrow, cramped space that smelled of machine oil and old, dry ink. We stepped inside, our candles now relit, their flames flickering in the stagnant air of the hidden chamber. And there we saw the source of the haunting that had paralyzed the household. The room was a small study, long forgotten by the current residents, and its walls were lined with shelves overflowing with mechanical blueprints and detailed diagrams of clockwork mechanisms. In the center of the room stood a curious device, a series of weighted pulleys and brass gears, connected to a long, articulated wooden rod that disappeared into a slot in the floor, a contraption designed to strike the boards above with a specific, rhythmic force that mimicked the sound of a human step. On a small mahogany desk lay a scattering of old correspondence, the paper yellowed and brittle with age, and as Holmes turned them over with a gloved hand, the story began to emerge from the ink. The letters were from a man named Elias Thorne, a master clockmaker who had once been in the general's employ, and they spoke of a deep-seated grievance, a debt unpaid, and a legacy stolen. One letter, dated 30 years prior, was particularly haunting, its words written in a cramped, vengeful hand, promising that the general would never find peace in his own home, that the rhythm of his own heartbeat would be echoed by the house until the end of time. There were blueprints for the device we saw before us, labelled with meticulous detail, showing how the weight of a falling water bucket in the cellar, regulated by a series of slow-dripping valves, would trigger the mechanism at the same hour every night. As I looked at the blueprints, I was struck by the sheer, cold brilliance of the design, a piece of engineering born of a mind consumed by a singular, focused resentment that had survived long after the man himself had likely passed into the earth. Holmes picked up a small brass oil can and examined the spout, noting that the oil was relatively fresh, a clear sign that someone within the house had been maintaining this mechanical ghost, keeping the gears turning and the pulleys moving in a secret ritual of remembrance or perhaps malice. We found a small stool in the corner where the caretaker must have sat, the wood worn smooth by years of use, and beside it, a half-finished cup of tea that was cold to the touch but still held the faint fragrance of bergamot. It was a domestic scene, strangely mundane amidst the machinery of a haunting, and it brought home the reality that the supernatural is often merely the cloak worn by the deeply, painfully human. We spent the remaining hours of the night in that hidden room, Holmes poring over the letters and diagrams with a scholar's intensity, his long fingers tracing the lines of the gears as if he were reading a musical score. He spoke softly of the tragedy of a mind like Thorne's, a man who could create such intricate beauty only to use it as a weapon of psychological torment, and how the house itself had become a living monument to a forgotten quarrel. Outside, the first grey light of dawn began to touch the tops of the trees, turning the mist into a pale, translucent veil, and we knew that the terror of the night was over, replaced by the cold, clear logic of the morning. We left the room exactly as we had found it, closing the hidden panel so that the secret remained ours for a little while longer. And as we walked back down the long corridor, the floorboards were silent beneath our feet, the rhythm of the past finally stilled by the light of the coming day. The staff would still wake in fear for a time, and the shadows of Blackwood Hall would still hold their secrets. But the ghost of the grandfather had been stripped of its spectral power, reduced to the ticking of a clock and the weight of a pulley. As we reached the front hall, the butler was already there, his face pale and drawn as he prepared to start the morning fires, and Holmes gave him a brief, enigmatic nod that seemed to settle the man's nerves more than any words could have. We stepped out onto the gravel path, the air crisp and sharp with the smell of wet earth and pine needles, and as I looked back at the imposing silhouette of the manor, I felt a strange sense of peace, as if the house itself were exhaling a long-held breath. The mystery was not gone, for life is rarely so simple, but the rhythm had changed, the heavy tread of the past replaced by the quiet, steady pulse of the present, and we walked away into the morning mist, the story of the ghostly footsteps now just another chapter in the long, whispered history of the evening. In the carriage on our way back to the station, Holmes remained silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the passing hedgerows and the distant, rolling hills of the countryside. The rhythmic clatter of the horses' hooves on the road seemed to echo the mechanical footsteps we had heard, a reminder that the world is built upon patterns and sequences, some natural and some forged by the hand of man. He eventually spoke of the clockmaker again, wondering if the man had ever felt the weight of the fear he had created, or if the act of creation itself had been enough to satisfy his wounded pride. It was a quiet reflection, a whisper of a thought that hung in the air like the steam from our breath. And as we pulled into the station, the world of steam and iron and everyday concerns felt far removed from the shadowed halls and ticking gears of Blackwood Hall. The story was told, the mystery unravelled, and as the train pulled away, I felt the familiar gentle tide of exhaustion beginning to wash over me, the memories of the night fading like the morning mist into the soft, quiet corners of the past. The train journey back to London was a slow and steady progression through a landscape draped in the soft, muted colours of an English morning, where the fields were silvered with frost, and the smoke from cottage chimneys rose in straight, unmoving columns against a pale blue sky. Inside the carriage, the rhythmic swaying and the steady, muffled roar of the wheels provided a soothing backdrop to our thoughts, a contrast to the jagged, unsettling rhythms of the night before. Holmes sat across from me, his chin resting on his hand, his eyes focused on some internal horizon as he processed the vast amount of data he had gathered from the hidden room. He had taken several of the smaller sketches with him, and I watched as he occasionally pulled them from his pocket to examine a specific detail of a gear or a lever, his expression one of profound professional respect for a fellow craftsman, even one whose motives were so dark. We spoke little of the case during those hours, for the atmosphere of the manor still clung to us like the scent of old wood, and it felt as though to speak too loudly of it would be to break the spell of the quiet mystery we had just navigated. Instead, we shared the remains of our sandwiches and watched the world go by. The small stations with their flower beds and waiting passengers, the bridges over narrow, winding rivers, and the distant spires of village churches. It was a time for the mind to settle, for the adrenaline of the night to dissipate and be replaced by the quiet satisfaction of a problem solved. Holmes eventually broke the silence by commenting on the acoustics of the manor once more, noting how the high-vaulted ceilings of the library had acted as a natural amplifier for the mechanical thumping, a detail that Thorne had clearly anticipated and utilised to its fullest effect. As the outskirts of London began to replace the green fields, the air grew heavier with the scent of coal smoke and the bustle of the city, a stark reminder of the world of logic and industry that Holmes called home. Yet, I knew that a part of him would always remain in those quiet corners where the shadows linger, where the past whispers its secrets through the grain of the wood and the rhythm of a hidden machine. The case of the grandfather's ghostly footsteps would be recorded in my journals, a tale of mechanical vengeance and the thin line between the seen and the unseen. But for now, it was enough to simply sit in the gathering twilight of the carriage and feel the steady, reassuring pulse of the journey. The world is full of such hidden rhythms, such quiet stories waiting to be told. And as we finally pulled into the station, the city lights twinkling through the evening haze, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the silent mysteries that make our lives so rich and so strange. The walk from the station to Baker Street was a familiar ritual, the cobblestones slick with a light rain that had begun to fall, reflecting the amber glow of the gas lamps in the puddles at our feet. The city was settling into its own evening rhythm, the shouts of the flower sellers and the rumble of the omnibuses creating a symphony that was as complex and as structured as any clockwork mechanism. We climbed the stairs to our rooms, where a fire had been laid by the ever-dependable Mrs. Hudson, and as the warmth of the hearth began to seep into my chilled bones, the terrors of Blackwood Hall felt like a dream, a half-remembered story told by a guttering candle. Holmes took up his violin and began to play a slow, melancholy air, the notes rising and falling like the tide, and I settled into my chair with a book, the scent of old paper and tobacco once again surrounding me in a comforting embrace. The night outside was dark and full of its own secrets, but here in our quiet corner of the evening, there was peace, a peace brought by the unravelling of a haunting and the understanding of a hidden heart. The shadows in the room were long and gentle, dancing in time to the music, and as I watched the flames leaping in the grate, I realized that the truest mysteries are not those that frighten us in the dark, but those that reveal the depth of human emotion, the lengths to which a soul will go to be remembered. The grandfather's footsteps were silent now, but their rhythm lived on in the stories we tell, in the quiet whispers of the past that remind us that nothing is ever truly forgotten, and that every shadow has a story to tell if we only have the patience to listen. And so, the evening unfolded, the music and the firelight weaving a tapestry of comfort and contemplation, a gentle end to a journey through the echoes of another man's life. The blueprints and the letters were tucked away, their secrets preserved but their power broken, and as the clock on the mantelpiece struck the hour, its clear, silver tone was the only rhythm that remained. It was a sound of the present, a steady mark of the passing time that carried us forward, away from the ghosts of Blackwood Hall and into the soft, welcoming embrace of the night. The story was finished, the mystery laid to rest, and in the quiet of the room, there was only the gentle breath of the fire and the lingering sweet scent of the evening mist. The shadows within the old manor of Blackwood Hall had a way of stretching themselves long before the sun had truly vanished beneath the horizon, creeping like ink spilled across an uneven parchment until the corners of the great drawing room were swallowed in a soft, velvety gloom. Sherlock Holmes stood by the tall, leaded windows, his silhouette a sharp and motionless contrast against the dying amber light of the afternoon. while the smell of old beeswax and the faint, lingering scent of lavender water hung heavily in the still air. I sat in a high-backed chair of frayed crimson velvet, watching the way the dust motes danced in the final shafts of light, their tiny, aimless journeys a quiet reflection of the stillness that had settled over us both. Outside, the wind began to sigh through the skeletal branches of the ancient oaks that guarded the estate, a low and mournful sound that seemed to carry the weight of centuries within its breath. The house was breathing with us, its timbers groaning softly as the warmth of the day departed, and the first fingers of the evening chill began to touch the stone walls. Holmes did not speak for a very long time, his gaze fixed upon the intricate carvings of the wainscoting that ran like a dark ribbon around the base of the room. Yet I could see the slight, rhythmic movement of his fingers against his coat, a sign that his mind was racing even as his body remained a statue of patience. The silence was not empty, however, for it was filled with the small domestic sounds that one only notices in the deepest hours of the night. The rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, the distant chime of a bell from the kitchen quarters, and the soft, repetitive tap of a loose shutter somewhere far above our heads. It was the cooling of the house that we were waiting for, that particular moment when the expansion of the day gave way to the contraction of the night. And, as the temperature began to drop, the atmosphere in the room shifted, becoming taut and expectant. Suddenly, a sound emerged from the very bones of the building, a dull, rhythmic thud that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards beneath my feet. A step, then another, measured and deliberate, as if an invisible weight were descending the great staircase just beyond the door. It was the sound that had driven the young heir, Arthur, to the brink of despair. The ghostly footsteps of his ancestor seeking a peace that the grave could not provide. Yet Holmes did not flinch. He merely turned his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as he followed the progression of the sound with the intensity of a predator. The footsteps continued, heavy and certain, moving along the corridor with a mechanical precision that lacked the uneven stumble of a human gait. And as they reached the wall behind which we stood, Holmes stepped forward, his hand reaching out to touch the dark wood. With a tenderness that was almost reverent, he moved his fingers across the grain, feeling for the subtle imperfections that the eye could not see. And as the sound reached its crescendo, a metallic click echoed through the room, sharp and discordant against the soft sighing of the wind. With a gentle pressure, a section of the panelling swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow, lightless cavity where the air smelled of machine oil and cold iron. Holmes lifted his lantern, the flame flickering as it cast a long, trembling beam into the darkness, illuminating a marvel of Victorian engineering that was as beautiful as it was sinister. There, suspended between the inner and outer walls, was a complex arrangement of brass gears, weighted pendulums, and long, thin rods of steel that stretched upward into the shadows of the floor above. "It is a masterpiece of deception, Watson," Holmes whispered, his voice barely louder than the rustle of dry leaves, "for it is the very breath of the house that gives it life." He pointed to a series of bimetallic strips, curved like the ribs of a bird, which were anchored to the exterior stonework and connected to the central mechanism by a delicate web of wires. As the stone cools at night, these strips contract at different rates, exerting a slow but irresistible force upon the gears, which in turn release these heavy leaden mallets to strike against the joists in a sequence that mimics the sound of a man walking. It is a clockwork spectre, triggered by the setting of the sun and the falling of the mercury. A ghost born of physics and spite. We stood in silence for a moment, watching the slow, inexorable turning of a large brass wheel as it prepared for the next footfall, the beauty of the craftsmanship standing in stark contrast to the cruelty of its purpose. The sound of the next strike boomed through the cavity, muffled by the wood but unmistakable in its rhythm, and I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the evening air. To think that someone would weave such a web of terror out of brass and steel, I remarked, my voice sounding thin in the vastness of the room. All to drive a man from his own home. Holmes nodded, his expression grim in the lantern light, and he gestured for me to follow him as he stepped back into the drawing room, closing the secret door until it sat flush with the wall once more. The perpetrator is not a spirit, Watson, but a man who knows the secrets of this house, as well as he knows the bitterness of his own heart, and I believe he is closer than we might imagine. Even as he spoke, the sound of a sharp intake of breath came from the darkened doorway, and a figure emerged from the shadows of the hall, his face pale and contorted with a mixture of fear and fury. It was Julian, the cousin who had been passed over in the will, the man who had spent his youth in the shadow of the estate, only to find himself cast out when the old man breathed his last. He stood there, his hands trembling at his sides, the light of our lantern catching the glint of a heavy iron key he held clutched against his palm, a key that likely opened the access panels he had used to maintain his mechanical haunting. "You had no right," Julian hissed, his voice cracking with the strain of his long-held resentment. "This house was meant to be mine. It has the rhythm of my blood in its stones, and he, that weak, trembling boy, does not deserve to walk these halls." Holmes did not move, his presence radiating a calm that seemed to fill the space between them, and he spoke with a quiet authority that brooked no defiance. "The law does not recognize the rhythm of blood when it is used to orchestrate a symphony of madness, Mr. Julian, and your clockwork ghost has finally run its course." The confrontation was not one of violence, but of a slow, inevitable surrender as the weight of Holmes's logic and the physical evidence of the machine stripped away the illusions Julian had built around himself. We sat with him in the dim light until the local constabulary arrived, the sound of the carriage wheels on the gravel driveway, a grounding, mundane noise that signalled the end of the supernatural nightmare. As they led him away into the cool night air, the house seemed to settle further, as if a great tension had been released from its frame, and the rhythmic thudding within the walls ceased, leaving only the quiet crackle of the dying fire in the hearth. Morning arrived with a soft, grey light that filtered through the mist, turning the gardens of Blackwood Hall into a landscape of silver and pearl. We sat in the breakfast room, the smell of toasted bread and strong dark tea, providing a welcome comfort after the long vigil of the night. Arthur, the young heir, sat across from us, the hollows beneath his eyes less pronounced now that the spectre had been unmasked, his hands steady as he poured the tea. "I cannot thank you enough, Mr. Holmes," he said softly, looking out at the morning fog that was beginning to lift from the lawn, "for you have given me back my home and my sanity in a single stroke." Holmes leaned back in his chair, a small, rare smile touching his lips as he watched the steam rise from his cup in delicate, swirling patterns. It was the house itself that told the story, Arthur, for a ghost does not wait for the temperature to drop before it walks, nor does it require oil to keep its joints from squeaking. It is a fine estate you have here, and now that the mechanical heart has been stilled, I trust you will find the peace that your grandfather intended for you. We finished our meal in a comfortable silence. The only sound, the clink of silver against china, and the distant, cheerful whistle of a bird in the hedgerow. The journey back to London was a long, slow passage through the English countryside. The train carriage, a private sanctuary of polished wood and plush upholstery. I watched the fields drift by, the green of the meadows punctuated by the occasional flash of a stream, or the huddled shapes of sheep against a hillside, while the rhythmic clack-clack of the wheels on the rails provided a much more pleasant cadence than the one we had left behind. Holmes sat opposite me, his head resting against the back of the seat, his eyes closed as if he were already cataloguing the details of the case into the vast archives of his mind. The scent of his tobacco, a rich and earthy aroma, filled the small space, mingling with the smell of the coal smoke that drifted past the window in thin, grey ribbons. As the city began to close in around us, the gentle quiet of the countryside giving way to the soot-stained brickwork and the crowded tenements of the outskirts, I found myself reflecting on the nature of the mysteries we pursued. "There is a comfort," I said to the air, "in knowing that even the most terrifying shadows can be chased away by the light of reason." Holmes opened one eye, the grey light of the afternoon reflecting in its depths, and he nodded slowly. "Reason is a flickering candle, Watson, but it is the only one we have to guide us through the fog, and as long as we keep it burning, the ghosts of the world will find no place to hide." The train pulled into the great iron-ribbed cathedral of the station, the air thick with steam and the clamour of 1,000 voices, yet the memory of the quiet halls of Blackwood remained with me like a fading dream. We stepped onto the platform, the familiar cold of the London mist wrapping around us like an old coat, and made our way toward the line of waiting hansom cabs. The horses' hooves on the cobblestones were a sharp, rhythmic accompaniment to the city's evening song, and as we climbed inside, the leather seat cool beneath my touch, I felt a profound sense of return. The lights of the street lamps began to flicker to life, casting golden pools of light upon the damp pavement. And as we turned onto Baker Street, the sight of our own windows, glowing with the promise of a warm fire and a waiting teapot, was the final, perfect resolution to the journey. We climbed the 17 steps with a familiarity that was its own kind of music, and as the door closed behind us, shutting out the noise and the chill of the world, the story of the grandfather's ghostly footsteps was laid to rest, leaving only the peace of the evening and the gentle, enduring silence of home. The amber glow of the hearth now retreats to a mere heartbeat of light, casting a soft and warm haze over the cluttered desk, where Watson's pen has finally ceased its rhythmic scratching against the paper. A lingering trail of grey smoke rises from the pipe Holmes has set aside, weaving through the stillness of the room like a ghost of the mystery they have just laid to rest, carrying with it the faint and comforting aroma of toasted tobacco and rain-dampened wool. Through the heavy velvet curtains, the silver moonlight spills across the floorboards in narrow ribbons, illuminating the dust motes that drift lazily in the quiet air, undisturbed by the cooling night. The distant chime of a clock tower echoes through the fog, a muffled and rhythmic pulse that marks the passage of time as the city of London settles into a deep and dreamless slumber. You can hear the soft creak of the floorboards and the gentle sigh of the wind against the chimney, sounds that serve only to deepen the sense of sanctuary found within these four walls. Holmes sits in his customary silence, a shadow among shadows, his sharp features softened by the fading firelight, as he yields at last to the stillness of the evening. It is a time for the mind to unburden itself, for the weight of the day to dissolve into the shadows of the corner, and for you to drift away on the tide of this peaceful resolution. The world outside is a distant memory, and here, in the glow of the dying embers, there is only the warmth of safety and the promise of a long and undisturbed rest.